So our first question, while we wait for everybody to join, is what's one word that comes to mind when you think of Meta's new campaign type, Advantage Plus? All right. Looks like AI coming in hot. Black box, a few there. Optimization, consolidation, PR money grab, cash grab. This is great. Volatility. Awesome. All right. Well, I think it's time to start our webinar session. Thanks everybody for joining the first poll. So today we're talking about Meta Advantage. We're going to find out, does it work, how brands are using it, and hopefully you'll be able to walk away with a few tips for how to approach it in your marketing strategy. A quick agenda for today. We're going to talk about the evolution of Meta, what Advantage Plus, what is it? We'll highlight some allocation and spend trends from the measured portfolio of brands. Then we'll analyze Advantage's performance, both as reported by Facebook and based on our own test results. Then we'll make some recommendations, and then we'll take the end of the session for live Q&A with our panelists. And speaking of our panelists, let's introduce them. Today we have Ben Dutter, SVP of Strategy at Power Digital Marketing. Welcome, Ben.
Thanks. Yeah, happy to be here.
And Andrew Cavato. Andrew is a measurement consultant with previous experience working at Snap, Google, Netflix, Meta, and others. Thanks for joining, Andrew. How are you?
Thanks for having me. Doing great. Excited to dive in.
Great. Also have Alex Lawrence, who is our Senior Director of our Professional Services team. Alex is a very experienced analyst who has been analyzing test results for a very long time. Alex, thanks for joining. How are you?
All good. Looking forward to it.
Great. And my name is Clay, and I am the Senior Director of Product Marketing here at Measured. Just a quick overview about Measured, if you're not familiar with us. Measured is an incrementality-powered media measurement and optimization platform. Since 2017, our vision has been to build the most comprehensive database of causal media performance insights that are readily available for instant and actionable decisioning. We now have over 25,000 tests in our database. These tests are leveraged by over 150 innovative brands who, in order to measure, analyze, and plan their advertising investments to drive sustainable marketing-driven growth. All right, let's kick it off with our first official poll. Again, if you recently joined, we are using Slido.com for polling and Q&A at the end. The first question here is, are you bullish on AI campaigns like Advantage Plus? And just to note, while folks are filling that out, you do have the option to start asking questions in Slido at any time. And then you also have the ability to upvote other questions within the Slido system so that later when we get to the Q&A, we'll hopefully be answering the questions that the most people had. Great. And it looks like skeptical but optimistic is the top answer here. Not surprising to me. Ben, Andrew, surprising to you guys or not really?
No, I think that's about right. It's the right attitude to have.
Great.
Yeah, I love the word skeptical. I'm skeptical about everything. So
awesome. All right. Well, let's jump into some content here. First, let's talk about what is ASC? What is Advantage? Alex, do you want to give us a quick rundown of what it is?
Yeah, certainly. So this launched in August 2022. Meta defines this as a campaign that leverages machine learning to help you reach valuable audiences with less setup time and greater efficiency. Basically, what that means is algorithms decide the ad placement and audience targeting across the portfolio. Some have called this an easy button, which basically streamlines the operation, optimizes for conversion rate. In exchange, you as the advertiser have less control and a little bit unclear reporting on results. And so one of the things we'll talk about today is, does Meta make good on its description, as you'll see here in the image, of helping you find new customers within this campaign? There's a lot going on here, but really this is an AI algorithm-driven campaign intended to maximize conversion rate and make your lives easier.
Awesome. Thanks, Alex. So now that we have a little bit of an understanding of what ASC, let's talk about the inventory that's available within ASC. Ben, you had a good analogy here. Do you want to tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, so ASC, is trying to kind of blend everything. We at Power Digital, we define it as like a meta blender. You just sort of dump everything, all the ingredients that is in the meta ecosystem from a targeting perspective, from a stage of the funnel perspective, from an inventory and placement perspective, and it just sort of determines on its own what it thinks is the right assignment of that ad unit at that time. And, it doesn't necessarily mean though that you don't have some control, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But at the end of the day, it is easier to set up, but it's harder to optimize and manage from a day-to-day perspective.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. And I think the interesting element here is that, as Alex mentioned, in the promise of convenience and potentially better performance, on the other side of that scale, you have the idea that you're potentially giving up some control, and that ultimately the reporting can be a bit of a black box. So today we'll kind of explore, is that really true? And what levers do brands really have in order to fine tune its performance? Great. All right, jumping along here. So now let's look at some allocation and spend trends from across the measured portfolio of brands. Before we do so, I think it's important to highlight what is incrementality and introduce it for folks who may not be as familiar with it. The chart on the right shows the average platform reported performance ROAS versus the incremental ROAS. This is averaged over the past year. As you can see, the method you use to measure the performance of your media can have a great impact on your allocation decisions. Google brand search is a great example of this. Consumers searching for your brand likely have a very high intent to purchase. Google will, in fact, take credit for every sale in which those consumers clicked on your branded search ad. When we measure with incrementality, we can see that the majority of those purchases were, in fact, not incremental. So in essence, incrementality measurement is about measuring the true contribution of media to your business outcome, whether that be sales, downloads, signups, site visits, or otherwise. At its core, incrementality measurement is about test and control experiments, most typically using a geo holdout test. Andrew, do you want to tell us a little bit about geo testing? What is it? How does it work? And why is it such a valuable tool for brands as they analyze their media's performance?
Yeah, absolutely. Geotesting, like you mentioned, it's a causal methodology, and what that means is that it allows you to scientifically verify or determine the contribution of your different media channels, or an aggregate of your media channels, on a business KPI. And by virtue of the fact that you are holding some markets back from seeing ads and comparing the behavior of those markets to ones in which you are continuing to show ads, you can really understand that behavioral difference that's driven by the ads. And so the particular way that these geotests are brought to life, particularly in a tool like Measured, you would have sort of an always-on business as usual campaign deployed, say, nationally in the US as an example. You could identify then some markets in which you would go dark and turn off your ads. And this could be, depending on the question that you're trying to ask, it could be, say, all of your ads across all of your channels, just some particular channels, et cetera. But let's say you just want to look at your total incrementality. You would shut those ads off in a couple of test markets, and then you would use the behavior of those control markets in which everything is business as usual to model out a predicted behavior if those ads were still on. In other words, a predicted counterfactual, to use the technical terminology, for those control markets. When you compare the predicted counterfactual behavior to the observed behavior in the control markets, or the test markets rather, you then are able to understand that delta and what that lift truly is. So geotesting is hugely important, especially today when we've got privacy changes in an environment where connecting conversions and ad exposures at a user level is very, very hard to do in most cases, and it's only going to get worse. And so a tool like geotesting is extremely valuable to be able to answer questions in a privacy safe manner, but also in a cross-platform manner. So that's another thing that geotesting lets you do. It sort of normalizes that measurement methodology across all of the different channels that you're deploying media upon. So I'm a huge fan of this. It's something that I recommend to most of my clients, if not all of my clients on the growth marketing side. And it's a hugely powerful tool that Measured, I think, has brought to life in a really great way, very scalable, easy to manage, easy to deploy. So I definitely highly encourage folks, and I imagine a lot of people on this call are already deep in the weeds of geotesting, but cannot underscore the importance of this tool and this methodology enough today.
Awesome. Thank you, Andrew. And I think the important kind of element you highlighted there too, that just at face value, is that as privacy regulations continue to become more stringent, finding ways to measure performance without requiring sensitive data is just a really key component of any marketer's measurement strategy. Geotesting, one of the ways brands can do that, and that's why we're big proponents of it. All right, we're going to jump into our next poll here as we jump into some additional performance data following this. Are you currently spending on Advantage? And again, if you haven't joined, you can go to slido.com, enter the code, and participate in our poll. And we are starting to see some great questions start popping up in the Q&A. So if you haven't yet, take a look there and feel free to drop your questions in. All right, we've got a handful of responses here. Looks like overwhelmingly the majority of respondents are spending on Advantage. Great. Let's see how this matches up to performance that we're seeing. All right. So here we see a chart showing the percent of measured brands adopting ASC. For comparison purposes, we've shown PMAX's adoption over time as well. Ultimately, brands are leaning into this channel, and it seems AI channels as a whole. While PMAX and ASC are inherently different, and you can see our previous PMAX webinar for details on that, it's definitely worth diving into this trend overall. Ben, are you seeing similar adoption with your brands? And how do you think this evolves over time as potentially more platforms embrace these AI type campaigns?
Yeah, I am definitely Power. We have a couple hundred clients that are on Meta right now, and the vast majority of them, I'd say it's probably closer to the poll results than these results here, are spending at least a little bit into ASC. Some of them are spending a significant amount, and I think we have some content on the share of spend later, so I won't showbiz that. But the overall mix of the portfolio is definitely moving this direction, and I think especially a lot of smaller brands that are in the 7-figure to low 8-figure, maybe they don't have the need for a really complicated ad structure setup. It's easier for them, especially if they're an SMB or an in-house team, to jump right into Meta with an ASC campaign and just get started. And it kind of, is like Alex said earlier, sort of the easy button, fire and forget structure.
Awesome. Thank you, Ben. Appreciate that context. And as you mentioned, we do have some kind of share of wallet trends here. I'll pull those up. And ultimately, while ASC adoption is growing, we're not necessarily seeing Meta's overall share of wallet growing. So ASC's share of wallet among measured brands is up to 26%, but overall Meta's total spend value has only increased by about 2% over the past year. Ben, does that kind of resonate with what you guys are seeing at Power Digital as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that Meta kind of hit an all-time low share of wallet probably about 18 months ago, and then it's slowly crept its way back up again. And I think a large part of that is from the advent of ASC and some of the improvements that they've done on the modeling side, on the optimization side. But we're actually seeing more than 26%. Our most recent number is over a third of all of our Meta spend is going to ASC, and some of our clients are as high as 75-80% of their spend going to ASC. So it really depends on the vertical, the size of the business, and kind of the maturity of their Meta program.
Great, thank you. Andrew, do you expect more platforms to start moving in this direction of these kind of easy button AI type campaigns?
I think that the leaders in the space, so the Googles and the Metas of the world, definitely set the roadmap and the tone for the type of ad products that are released. I would not be surprised at all if we see this this sort of trend continue with other platforms jumping on the bandwagon. And, I do think that that there are some advantages to these types of campaigns, certainly in a workflow creation, and probably appeals to advertisers that don't have as much resource to put toward really understanding how to build a campaign in a granular capacity, and so can take a lot of that burden off of their plate. So I can see why there would be an appeal out there. But based on the polling that we've seen just here in the webinar, a lot of folks are skeptical, and rightfully so. And so as these products do come to market, whether it's a Meta or other places, it's extremely crucial that we look into rigorous testing and understand how do we deploy these campaigns in an efficient capacity. And that, I think, is something that's going to be variable by business and by need.
Yeah, and we're already seeing it, Clay, and TikTok. Back in, I think it was in March or April, they released their kind of smart performance campaign structure, which is kind of an ASC or PMax knockoff. So I think that we're starting to see a lot of the big ad platforms move in this direction. It'll be interesting if you start to see it in more like programmatic or open web inventory as well, which I think is kind of the next frontier. But for now, in the walled gardens, absolutely, I think this is where it's headed.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. And additionally, something you mentioned, Ben, is that the share of wallet spend does vary widely across brands. You have, maybe on average a third of Meta spend going to ASC, but some brands as high as 75 to 80%. And as we dive into some more of the results here that we're going to look at in a second, we'll see that this answer remains true both for how much brands are spending, but also potentially in its performance.
Hey, Clay, can I just quickly add the red one at the bottom? It says retargeting. That's retention spend, just to clarify. I think there was a question.
Yes.
Just
correct.
That's been stable over time.
Good, correct. Yes, that is a correction. This should be retention. Great. Thank you, Alex. All right, jumping ahead here. So we're going to look into some performance results, and we're going to start with what Meta is saying. So Meta reported performance from their platform, and then we're going to look at how that compares to our measured test results. Alex, do you want to tell us a little bit about what Meta is saying? And just to note, this is median data from across our entire portfolio of brands. Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, so we looked at a few things here. CPM, conversion rate, and conversion rate here is based on impressions, and then the cost per order. Again, conversion rate and cost per order are based on Facebook reported numbers. We want to understand, what can this tell us about the actual inventory that is being given? We know that this is sort of a blender, and we want to see how that plays out. So a few interesting insights here. The most important thing is you are not buying a prospecting campaign by default, unless you are going out of your way to set it up that way. It will give you a mixture of audiences. And so what we see here is that this, on average, is priced like prospecting. So you can see the CPM here is a bit lower than prospecting and about 50% lower than retargeting, significantly lower than retention. But the conversion rate, is higher. So it's higher than prospecting, but not quite as good as retargeting and retention. As a result, the in-platform cost per order is also sort of in the middle of these three things. And so, at face value, you might say, this is great. I pay less and I get more. It converts more efficiently as a lower cost per order. But in reality, you shouldn't be comparing this purely to prospecting. It really depends on how you set up your campaigns. And you need to understand incrementality in order to properly evaluate whether or not this is working for you. And we'll talk about that a little more on the next slide, but it's a really critical piece of the puzzle in terms of evaluating ASC.
Great. Thanks, Alex. So now we've got kind of what Meta is saying about its performance. And to summarize, it sounds like it's kind of being reported as a middle of the road performer, maybe lower cost, slightly higher performance than some prospecting. But on this chart on the right, we have included test results from our first batch of geo tests with brands. And you'll see the three bars on the right, the three sets of bars show the lower quartile, the median quartile, and the upper quartile for the incremental ROAS that we're seeing in these test results. Alex, do you want to tell us about these test results and how to interpret this?
Yeah, it sounds good. So these results, there's been about 30 tests over the past 12 months that we've run. So it's still early days. I say this will evolve over time, but there's some clear trends emerging here. So on average, if you take the median, you can see here that the median incremental ROAS falls below prospecting and retargeting. So what this says is, on average, the average brand, may not be getting better performance than they would from these other traditional campaigns, but the upper quartile clearly outperforms. And your question should be is what can you be doing from a setup and execution standpoint to fall in that upper quartile versus sort of the bottom half, the lower median, sort of the median or the lower quartile. There's things like audience definition, percent allocation to existing audience customers. Ben, I'd really love to hear your perspective in managing these campaigns and helping your clients set this up in terms of what are some of the things that we should be thinking about as we're trying to, land more in the upper quartile versus sort of the median number we're seeing here.
Yeah, for sure. What I've seen Advantage Shopping does particularly well is find new customers. And most of my clientele are in a kind of a growth stage of their business, like sub $50 million a year revenue. And they're really focused on customer acquisition, especially in Meta overall. And so we view Advantage Plus as kind of an addition or a replacement to prospecting. And I think the issue that we see a lot of accounts that we audit and bring over to Power or that are being run by in-house teams is they've sort of just consolidated everything into ASC, and they're allowing the system to optimize towards what it sees fit. And that might be a heavy amount of the media going towards existing customers or towards recent engagers, because those typically have the best platform attributed ROAS. You see that a lot where somebody has a very high degree of intent. They've engaged a lot with the social following. They've engaged a lot with the website. They maybe have added to cart. If allowed to its own devices, ASC will definitely prioritize those people. And we found that has become generally less incremental than when you are running more of a heavy prospecting focus from ASC. So for us, it's really about, what is its job in the overall marketing mix? What are we wanting it to do? And what we've found it to be the most successful is get new customers. And so there's some clear setup parameters. And what we found is sort of the best practice. I don't like that term, best practice, but sort of the best practice starting point is a 10% cap on existing customers. So 90% of the budget going towards new customers, and supplementing it with some intentional non-ASC campaigns as well, based on if you have a big product feed, maybe you want to do some DPAs, et cetera, et cetera. We can get in the weeds if there's questions around that, but really having ASC focus on customer acquisition and building the structure out to emphasize that.
Awesome. Thank you, Ben. That's great context. Alex, anything else to add there?
No, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, you really have to control this. It's an algorithm, right? And you have to make it work with you and not against you. So I think that's great advice generally from Ben.
Thanks, guys. Okay, so moving on to our next slide here. I think the big question that you then are left with is, okay, so if we take that median value, obviously there's a wide span of performance depending on how brands are using ASC, setting it up, the type of share of wallet they're putting towards it. But if we look at the median value from our initial batch of test results, we can see how Meta kind of ranks here towards the bottom of this select group of tactics. We do have this data for a lot of other tactics, but just to highlight here where it lands from some of the biggest tactics that brands are investing in. At the median, probably not a silver bullet, that is kind of promised if you tend to do, what Ben said not to do, which is just kind of dump a lot of your existing strategic campaigns into ASC and aren't fine tuning it. Andrew, can you tell us a little bit about what this means for brands and how they should approach this, and the different ways brands can think about measuring their media using Facebook data versus incrementality data, and maybe a little bit of background on that?
Yeah, sure. I think as with, first of all, a quick commentary on this slide. If this is not, Meta is not unique in reporting one type of ROAS and actually from an incrementality perspective being far below that. Like you can tell from this graph that you have, with very few exceptions, there's usually a pretty big delta between what is shown on a platform in terms of ROAS and what is actually the true ROAS as measured from an incrementality perspective. And the reason for that is of course that the platforms are both measuring and displaying performance, or rather displaying performance and optimizing for that performance from a post-exposure perspective. So while there are some advances to try to shoehorn that performance into an incrementality, into driving incrementality, really, if you peel back all the layers and you look at the absolute guts of how all these platforms are built, it's all optimizing on an action that's taken post-exposure to an ad, not an action that is taken because of an exposure to an ad, which is a subtle difference, but a very important one, and actually one that has, you know, implications to the entire ad tech stack. And so we're so far along, and all of these platforms have a big, you know, a great flywheel going that's centered around this post-exposure attribution and measurement paradigm, that it's not really likely that it's going to change, at least not overnight. So in any case, that's why it's important to first of all understand that that's the backbone of all of this and the backdrop of all of this. But second of all, to really lean into measuring from an incrementality perspective, because what you're going to see on the platforms from, you know, from their first party metrics is not going to be reflective of truly the value, the causal value that these tactics are driving for your platform. So this is just another, you know, kind of underscoring, or another reason why it's very important to have a rigorous testing agenda around not just your overall marketing practices, but if you're going to add something new to it, you're going to want to make sure that you are measuring it and testing it the right way, and not sort of going off of what's out there from a first party platform perspective. So I would really strongly recommend that that you kind of do that A/B test, do that sort of business as usual versus ASC test if we're going to lean into this. And you know, as you do that, you'll probably find ways to get the most value out of it, as you would with any tactic. And if you have a properly designed learning agenda around it, you know, you're gonna be able to find a way to make it work. Or if it's too hard, you're gonna find an easier place to invest that money. And that's a perfectly acceptable answer. I think marketers need to be agnostic to the tools and ad products that are at their disposal, and really let the data guide them in terms of what's easiest to deploy, what gives me the most bang for my buck, and what's driving the most incrementality.
Great, thanks, Andrew. Ben, any commentary there? Or
Yeah,
thoughts?
something to add to that. I think it's interesting, you know, looking at it in a snapshot like this, what isn't reflected on here is the scale side and the amount of potential headroom you have in a given channel based on your audience, based on your product set, based on your business maturity. And so, like, yeah, Google search brand might have a decent iROAS, but it can only spend maybe a couple, 3% of your revenue per year, unless you have an enormously successful brand, right? But compare that to, you know, Meta prospecting or Meta ASC, theoretically, it could scale almost infinitely, right? You know, hundreds of millions of dollars, depending on the product. So for that, some of it is from a media mix perspective. To Andrew's point, you want to test to make sure that your efficiency metrics are right and you are getting the right ROI on your given tactics, but there's also a scale component there too. And so Snap beating Meta, for example, if I can only spend 1/20th the amount I can spend on Snap, that doesn't really help me much if I'm trying to scale my brand. So I do think that the way that you set it up, the maturity of your business, and the overall complexity of your mix has an impact on all of these numbers as well.
And actually, Clay, I want to just add one more thing on top of that. I like this point about scale, Ben. I think it's very, very important. You know, as we think about scale as well, one of the components here is that if you're looking at a first party post-exposure perspective and paradigm and all of this stuff, that scale, it sort of elongates that saturation point a little bit, where, you know, it looks like you can spend more and keep that performance level reasonably high before it starts to drop off. Whereas, at least in the testing that I have done, it's not the case at all when you're looking at things from an incrementality perspective. And so if you know, that saturation point comes a lot closer when you're measuring from an incrementality perspective in most cases. So that's why it's very important again to have that perspective, and there's a lot of dimensions on which you can do your testing and design your learning agenda around. But scale and sort of the intersection of scale and performance, that looks vastly different from an incrementality perspective versus say a last click or a post exposure perspective.
Great
And Clay,
point.
I'll add too, just, I mean, we spend a lot of time at Measure having our clients understand what is the right incremental ROAS number they want to achieve. This is a performance campaign. It's intended to drive conversion. So if you're seeing a ROAS number that's more in line with something intended to drive awareness, I'd say that's a red flag, because TikTok, for example, it can work well, but a lot of our clients use that to generate awareness. Or if you're comparing this to something like CTV or more upper funnel, like that is not a good sign, and you need to evaluate it accordingly. That's again why testing is so important. You could, depending on how you set this up and manage it, you could be near the bottom as we see here, or it could be the absolute best tactic in your mix overall at driving conversion. And you need to understand that with confidence before you really start to make a decision about, do I shuffle budget within Meta, or do I pull from something else into Meta based on this performance? But I think all the points that Ben and Andrew had are also great.
I think that's a really interesting point, Alex, and something that we do see a lot of kind of conversation around with our clients around incrementality, is that when you're using a common metric like incrementality across a handful of different platforms, you're able to adjust within the section of the funnel that you're optimizing, as opposed to just thinking about it within channel. And I think that that's a transition that a lot of brands make as they become more advanced, which is, oh, I have my Facebook budget. How can I reallocate dollars within these different campaign types within Facebook, rather than, hey, I have Google, Facebook, TikTok, and Snap, and I have a prospecting objective. How can I reallocate dollars across those channels within that particular funnel objective in order to meet my goal? So I think what you're saying here is make sure that you're thinking about ASC as a specific kind of strategic element of your funnel, whether that be upper funnel or lower funnel, and make sure that you're comparing it effectively to other tactics in other channels, for example, that are also designed to achieve that particular objective. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, if you have an overall ROAS target you're aiming for, what usually happens is, conversion focused tactics will outperform that, and your upper funnel ones will underperform that. In net aggregate, you should hit that number you're trying to achieve. Keep in mind, this is a performance campaign. It exists to optimize conversion and drive sales. And so it should behave accordingly. If it's not, that's an indication that maybe there's, a campaign setting to change, or it's just not working for you for whatever reason. But you need to be very aware of that before you start to make serious decisions about how you're allocating more or less budget around ASC.
Great. Awesome. Thank you, guys. Before we jump into kind of our summary of recommendations, just want to highlight we have a handful of questions coming into the Q&A on Slido. Again, on the bottom of the screen there, you can see the code to enter if you want to ask a question or upvote other questions. And it looks like we're going to have quite a bit of time to get into Q&A. So looking forward to that. All right, so let's talk about recommendations here. ASC, as we've seen, is potentially a very powerful tool, but it must be managed. It is probably not the set it and forget it or easy button solution that AI campaign types are potentially being pitched as. So importantly, you need to be conscious to make sure that the algorithm is aligned to your particular objectives, and that you're fine-tuning it to do as such. Alex, do you want to walk us through a few of those kind of campaign setup concepts we talked about? And then Ben and Andrew, please feel free to chime in and add additional commentary here.
Yeah, great. So the first two here are really important around campaign setup. The first one is how you define, Facebook calls, or Meta calls it, the existing customer definition. So you can take that literally and define that as past purchasers, for example, and that will be the universe that Meta believes to be sort of your lower funnel audience. You can also add in other groups, engagers, add to cart, site visitors, etc. How you set that up is really the first sort of foundational layer of how you can start to make this algorithm work better for you. So the more signal and definition you feed into that, the more control that you can have when you start to get to the second point, which is understanding what % of your budget do you want to allocate to that defined audience. And so the higher the % you set, the more the more signal you're giving or the more room you're giving Meta to spend against that lower funnel audience and likely getting less incrementality. The smaller the percentage you set, the less room you're giving them to spend against that, and you're likely get a more incremental conversion. So you really need to think about what is the role of this overall and how do you define and set up these campaigns? What instructions do you give to the algorithm to then go and optimize against? So I think those are the first two. The third one here is really all about for testing incrementality. We've said this, I feel like on almost every slide today. It's so important because of 1 and 2 here. How you set that up and how you manage these campaigns will dramatically influence the result that you're going to get. And so that is that's a critical one here. Clay, I can keep going on 4 and 5 if you'd like, or.
Yeah, feel free.
Great. I mean, I guess Ben and Andrew, do you guys have any thoughts on those first 3 before we get to the?
Yeah, I touched on it briefly. I think what we start with often is a 90% towards new customer, 10% towards existing. We have some clients that run 0% towards existing, right? And I think there was a comment or a question in the Slido chat around, they have very high frequency, for example, because they think even at a 3% share towards their existing customers, ASC just keeps hitting the same people over and over and over and over again. And so you get a very, very high frequency, which can be wasteful. So setting those up correctly. And I think a missing tactic that a lot of brands overlook is ensuring that they have the right server-to-server integrations for actually accurately identifying those customers. We've talked a little bit about data deprecation and the regulation around privacy. And if Meta's not getting a good clean signal back on who those existing customers or engagers are, then it won't be able to accurately exclude them. There's obviously the out-of-the-box CAPI integrations that you can do, but there's also other third-party tools that are significantly better. And if you're spending a significant amount of money in ASC or in Meta in general, then I strongly advise looking into using those tools to make sure that the match and the passback rate is strong within Meta.
Great, thank you, Ben.
The only thing I'd add to that is that if you're going to be measuring the performance from an incrementality perspective, you have to understand that there's a bit of alchemy that goes into the setup here, because nothing out of the box, per the commentary I had before, is going to directly imply a greater or smaller amount of incrementality. Much like any ad product out there that isn't optimized on that, you have to figure out what levers work in your particular instance to elicit that incrementality. It's not necessarily going to be super intuitive all the time, right? You can start kind of thinking logically, but don't be afraid to try, kind of wild stuff. It may work for your particular instance. And again, like, because these things aren't inherently optimized around causality and incrementality, there's a sort of a wide variety of different combinations of how it's set up that can make you work. And so I would definitely lean on the general guidance that's being offered here from things that we know is starting, at least in this early stage of data, to yield that incrementality. We know what the important levers are, but there could be other ones. And so don't be afraid to kind of think outside the box on this stuff.
Great. Thanks, guys. That's great commentary. And I think you kind of covered 4 and 5 there for us. Andrew, 5 being stay flexible, try new things, and 4 being really evaluating ASC relative to its objective against other options within your media mix. Okay, great. Let's jump into our Q&A. We've got about 19 minutes for some discussion. We've got a lot of questions here coming in. Before we do, we have one more poll, our final poll for the audience, just to see, overall, do you think you'll continue or will you increase spend in Advantage? Jump on Slido. There's your code right there if you want to participate. And then that is also where you can select the Q&A tab and ask questions for the panel. And results coming in here. I've got about 25 responses. And it looks like most are going to increase their spend in Advantage. A handful saying it's complicated and does seem to be catching up, but no is a very small percentage. So overall, yes, but it's complicated. Ben, Andrew, does that surprise you at all?
No, and I think we've been touching on it all day today, is it's worth investing in. and it's worth testing into. One of the things that I caution a lot of clients against, though, is don't just dabble in it. The joke at Power Digital is dabbling is another word for wasting. You have to really take a big swing. And I think, Andrew, you touched on this earlier. When there is a bit of alchemy in that, and there's a bit of courage required to make these bigger swings, right? But you have to get to an answer quickly. And if you're just, let's say you're spending, 100K a month in Meta overall, and you put 5K towards ASC, it's not going to tell you anything, right? You need to take a bigger bite at the apple. And so to me, that's the main takeaway is you should test into it. But if you test into it, make sure it's at a meaningful number where you actually can get real results out of it.
It's great feedback.
I'd 100% echo that. I think that's a general statement I would say that applies to most tests. The place where I see growth marketers fail the most is exactly what Ben described as dabbling. Dabbling sucks. Don't dabble. Learn quick, learn big, and then move on. You'll be able to, if you really put some effort and resources to a test, you'll be able to get to an answer a lot quicker and a definitive answer, and then you can move on. Right? Whether it works for you, you can iterate on it, or you can, shelve it and try something else. But it's the time that goes into trying to extract value from a dabbling experiment is totally not worth it.
Great last recommendation there. All right. Let's jump into our Q&A. We've got a lot of questions here. We're going to kind of try and pile through them. First question, our Facebook pod has advised us to launch ads initially in BAU, business as usual, and then move the winners into ASC. We have seen success here. Is that a strategy anyone else has seen success with? Ben, might be a good one for you to kick off.
Yeah, for sure. I think, there's a lot of debate, and I don't want to give anyone the wrong gospel here. It's somewhat dependent upon the industry and the brand maturity and even your maturity in Meta. But yes, in general, I do think that's a viable strategy, is to you want your test-based creatives and your test-based campaigns to be as close to your evergreen as you can, because unfortunately, we see it all the time where we have a standalone dedicated test structure. It works great, and then you bring it over into BAU or you bring it over in ASC and it doesn't work well, and it throws off the whole kind of recipe of how Meta is operating. So the BAU to ASC pipeline, I think, is fine. Where I'm seeing actually more success is just using ASC as my main prospecting driver and doing a lot of creative testing within that itself. But it's more of a gamble, to our point earlier.
Thanks, Ben. And just to tack on to that, something you touched on, there's another question in here about verticals. So are you seeing success with certain verticals more so than others at this stage?
Yeah, so my answer is biased because Power, about 2/3 or so of our clients are e-commerce. So it's definitely going to be skewed towards e-commerce. If you're more of a omni-channel retail brand, or you're more of a B2B brand or something like that, it's going to be different. But for e-commerce in particular, D2C e-commerce, we see usually mass reach, broader product sets work better with ASC. So it's not necessarily like fashion versus entertainment, not that kind of verticalization, but more around, is this a very niche product versus a more mass appeal product? And lower AOV also tends to work well. I think that is generally true of any algorithmic optimized campaign because it's getting a faster feedback loop. So we do see it work for some $1,000 plus AOV high fashion brands, and we see it not work for some $50 AOV brands too. But generally the trend has been better in lower AOV, bigger TAM verticals.
Great. Thanks, Ben. We got another one here. Andrew, this might be a good one for you to start off with. Do you guys buy into the belief that the optimization algorithm is different for ASC versus standard conversion optimization?
Interesting point. I mean, Ben had some thoughts on this, and apparently it's a little bit different. And so there's probably some changes and some advances that have been applied to ASC. I'm not going to speak to that, but what I can definitely speak to is that the underlying core of this ad product and all their ad products is done at a post-exposure basis. So until that changes, you can do a lot of really cool things, and you can sort of close the gap from correlative to causal to a certain degree by doing a lot of sophisticated things on the delivery front, on the recommendation front, and all of that. But ultimately, you're never going to cross that chasm until the underlying basis for that optimization is actually incremental. And like I say, that's a huge step to take, a huge paradigm shift. So is it better? Is it improved? Is it more advanced? Probably. Is it causal? No.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I think it's a nuanced discussion, because what we've seen and what I understand, the changes in ASC evolved out of the recent turbulence that they had around trying to invest more time to get users to stay on the platform. TikTok, the average time on platform and the average times opened per day beat Meta for the first time in 2022, and it's still a little bit better in 2023. And so I think there was a strong reaction from Meta leadership and engineering to, obviously the time spent on the platform is their lifeblood, because that's how they can sell more ads, right? And so they wanted to create a system that made people more engaged organically with the actual content recommendation algorithm. And that we have seen improve, and we've verified that with our own data. We verified that through third parties. eMarketer has done a study on that. And that's irrefutable, that the time spent per person per day is up. Now, what the reason for that matters to ASC is the theory, the kind of the back channel, not official lingo of this, is that they've used that same algorithm to then start making ad content recommendations as well, so that the user finds more value and more affinity to the type of creative content in an ad in the same way that they would with organic content. And so we've seen that anecdotally kind of makes sense, because on our data, ASC and overall Meta incrementality is up year over year. And it's actually, I would argue, one of the strongest channels from a incremental scale perspective that is out there today. So I believe it. At first I was very skeptical. A year ago, I was like, nah, this is a cash grab or whatever. But I do actually think that they have optimized the algo to be more around content engagement. And that does seem to lend itself towards better incrementality.
Great. Thanks, Ben. That's a great answer. We do have a question about testing, so we do want to get to that one as well. Alex, this might be a good one for you to kind of start us off on. Should we incrementality test ASC alone or ASC in addition to our BAU strategy?
Yeah, this is a complicated question. I mean, we don't, Meta has been less clear than Google about how these things interact. So if you think of PMax as a comparison, Google has been more forthcoming about how those sort of normal and not and automated PMax campaigns compete with each other. I think certainly you should, if you're dabbling, as we talked about, you should be confident about the incrementality of your various campaigns, because they're going to be very different audiences. If you're all in, more all in on ASC, that's less relevant. But I think to the extent that you are sort of splitting your budget into 50-50 or into thirds based on these different dimensions we've looked at, I think you need to be really, really confident about what the incrementality looks like. Traditional prospecting, retargeting, that we've tested that a ton of times. I think we know pretty well how that will behave, but I do think you need to think of them separately. Ben, Andrew, do you guys agree with that?
Yeah, I do. And I think, again, it comes back to how you're setting up ASC. What's its job to do? Are you looking at this from hey, this is a lifestyle business for me, and I want to have an easy campaign to run that kind of is fire and forget? Or is this, hey, I'm actually really serious about customer acquisition and optimizing towards incrementality? I assume if you're on this webinar, you're in the latter group. And as such, I think having a clear understanding of what my total marketing is, what my channel marketing is, and then what my tactic marketing is from an incrementality perspective, and that full funnel is important to be able to assess where you're allocating your next media dollar. And I also will just add to that with ASC in particular, there's some nuances with how you can do certain geo targeting and certain holdout groups with running simultaneous BAU campaigns. I won't get into all the the nuts and bolts of that, definitely talk to your Measured rep for that. But there's some specific criteria that has to be done in order to get a clean test with ASC.
Yeah, I think the average like small to medium business in America, this is a great product for someone who doesn't have a lot of expertise, right? You set it, you forget it. I mean, it won't be as optimal as it could be, but it's going to be a lot better than you manually tinkering. But if you're spending 8+ figures on media, you are a lot more sophisticated and need to be a lot more confident and understand how this performs overall in order to achieve your objectives. So completely agree with all the advice just given there by Ben.
Great. Thanks, guys. We have a couple setup specific questions. Let me see. Ben, you mentioned ad engagers for Advantage, but that audience type is not available to exclude in the existing customers. Do you have a workaround for that?
Yeah. So, and I was a little loose with my verbiage there. You have that one custom audience that you can exclude, and within that custom audience, you can only include folks who've engaged with your site or customers. So ad engagers, I that's a bit of a Freudian slip. You can't exclude just people who, for example, who just viewed a video. But if they clicked on an ad and went to the site, then you can exclude them. What I have seen, it's not really a workaround, but it's sort of a funnel structural optimization, is have a dedicated retargeting campaign specifically built around ad engagers. And jury's out on if the system is able to actually really intentionally read into that. My hunch is that it can, and that we see frequency go down in ASC when you have those retargeting campaigns turned on. And I think the system is optimizing more, or it's allocating more of its budget towards more cold audiences in that case. So it's not a clean workaround where you can just say like exclude video viewers, but you can kind of get there with some structural shifts.
Awesome. Thank you. That's a great answer, Ben. Okay, let's do one more question. One question that did get upvoted to the top was in terms of setup, specific best practices executed by that top quartile of advertisers. Alex, do we have any kind of, for us, we're pretty big data nerds, and 30 tests, is not the largest sample size for us yet. So I don't know if we can make any exact, comments there, but are there any trends that we're seeing within our portfolio for brands who are in that top quartile?
Yeah, we have about 30 tests, right? So I don't want to make any definitive statements. I think there's three things that you can do probably to bias yourself towards more incremental conversions. One is how you define that audience, as we've talked about. Two is the percent of the budget that goes against that defined audience. And then the third one, which is more of a hypothesis that we currently have internally, hasn't really been proven yet, is there's a lot of competition between your normal campaigns and your ASC campaigns. That may impact your performance overall, whether that impacts incrementality or simply in-platform conversion. I don't necessarily know, but I think to Ben and Andrew's point earlier about dabbling, I think that's another example about if you try to dabble too much, I think you're probably hurting yourself. But again, we don't have a massive enough data set really to know that with confidence. I think that's sort of an early sign that we're seeing. I'm curious if the others agree with that. Those are three things that come to mind for me.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's too soon to tell. What I will say is that we track the incrementality at Power of Meta overall from a combination of media mix and experiments. And actually we share a lot of clients with Measured. And we have seen that the iROAS Meta overall has tended to trend up with more budget going towards ASC. So it's not a great data-driven direction yet, but it's, there's a leading indicator there. The things tactically that I've seen work well is, again, really minimize that percentage towards your excluded audience as much as you can, especially if you have a more structured account funnel where you have like a dedicated retargeting campaign or a dedicated retention campaign. Especially if you have like a big SKU list, like you're going to be running DPAs or something, you want to be really kind of intentional with where you exclude those audiences. So that's one thing. I mentioned it earlier, but the other big thing is the making sure that your server to server integration is really clean and that you are getting verified first party data and verified customers into the funnel and back to the platform. And then number three, and we've all said it in one way or another, is spend enough on it, because it needs it needs enough data to actually be effective. We've seen it where it's not effective running at a relatively low media mix, and then we test it at a heavier media mix, and it's more incremental. So the efficiency curve actually improves at a certain point, which is interesting. So you want to take a meaningful approach into it. There's also a lot of nuance around creative and all those kinds of things that, we probably can't get into, but I think in general, all of that comes back to giving the algo enough information for it to actually be successful and prioritizing the type of information that your business wants it to optimize toward.
The other thing I'll add just as an observation, right around the time ASC was really ramping up, Meta removed the audience overlap tool within the platform. And I'm not going to read too much into that. You guys can draw conclusions as you'd like, but if there wasn't a lot of overlap, I think there would be probably an interest in keeping that alive. We use that a lot internally at Measured when we were seeing sort of strange behaviors. I would love to look at that now and see what that looks like. I think there probably is a lot of overlap between some of these campaigns. But obviously I don't know that for sure.
Andrew, any thoughts on why they might have removed that? I know we don't want to get too far into it, but or any comment?
I'm not going to speculate on it. But yeah, just at the end of the day, all of this stuff is just a leading indicator and a proxy for the true measurement, which is incrementality. So frankly, you have to kind of disassociate as much as you can from that and really look at the ultimate driver of performance, which is that true causal lift. And so if we're measuring that, you shouldn't really care about overlap or how the algorithm works or what the setup looks like. You could have like, totally random, something that doesn't make any intuitive sense. But if it's working and you're proving it out scientifically that it's working, that's all that matters. And so make sure that you're testing it properly. And that's really, really what it boils down to.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you guys so much. We are just at the top of the hour. I want to thank all of our audience participants in our polls and Q&As. We will do a follow-up with the recording for everybody who registered, and we'll likely also include an FAQ for some of the questions we did not get to. If you'd like to learn more about Measured, please go to measured.com/demo. We are happy to share more benchmark data with you if you have other questions about specific tactics or channels. We do a measurement consultant with brands who come to ask us questions about their performance. And we can also give you a tour of the Measured platform if you'd like to learn more. Thank you, everybody. Hope everybody has a great rest of their day. And thank you for joining. And we will see you next time. Thank you, panelists. And we'll see you soon.